Hey guys, today we're going to discuss 3 cold cases out of the state of Missouri. We're going to discuss the murder of Laura Michele Dinwiddie, the disappearance of Tammy Surdam, and the disappearance of Gina Dawn Brooks. We're going to discuss details of each of their cases and how all of their cases tie into the man you see pictured here. His name is Nathan Williams, and he has links to every one of their cases, yet he has not been convicted of any of them. Okay, so we're going to check out this publication from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from November of 1996. It gives a brief timeline on the death of Laura Michele Dinwiddie and the disappearance of Gina Dawn Brooks. I'm also going to add in the date that Tammy Surdam had gone missing. So let's get started. On March 4th, 1975, Laura Michele Dinwiddie, age 23, was found stabbed to death in her apartment in North St. Louis. Nathan Williams would have been 14 years old at that time. In November of 1978, Nathan Danny Williams, then 18, tells a bartender that he knows who killed Dinwiddie. Williams fingers a former friend who is arrested but later released when police are unable to gather any evidence against him. On August 1st, 1979, 12-year-old Tammy Surdam went missing from St. Charles, Missouri, never to be seen again. In November of 1979, a 13-year-old girl is brutally attacked, held against her will with a meat cleaver against her throat in a garage in South St. Louis. Williams, 19, pled guilty and is sentenced to 7 years in prison. In March of 1985, Williams is paroled. The very next month, guys, in April of 1985, he is arrested on a suspicion of robbery. His parole is revoked and he returns to prison. In July of 1987, Williams is released from the Missouri Department of Corrections, having served his entire sentence. On August 5th, 1989, Gina Dawn Brooks, age 13, disappeared while riding her bicycle near her home in Fredericktown, Missouri. She is never heard from again. On October 6th, 1989, 1 month and 1 day later, a 10-year-old girl is attacked in Belle Reve Park in South St. Louis. William is arrested 4 days later and charged. On September 7th, 1990, William is found guilty of the sexual assault of the girl in Belle Reve Park. He is later sentenced to a 30-year prison term for the forcible rape and sodomy as a persistent sexual offender. In June of 1995, Captain David Heath, commander of the St. Louis Police Department's Crimes Against Persons Divisions, decides to reopen the Dinwiddie case after receiving a letter from her mother inquiring about the case. In July of 1996, Homicide Detective Chris Pappas interviews Williams about the Dinwiddie case at the Farmington Correctional Center. Williams says he was present but did not kill her. Again, he fingers the same man and also the man's brother. From July through November of 1996, Pappas interviews more than 50 people. He and other officers believe that Williams is the prime suspect in the killing of Dinwiddie and the disappearance of Gina Dawn Brooks. Okay guys, so we're going to talk about the disappearance of Gina Dawn Brooks. Gina was last seen in her hometown of Fredericktown, Missouri on August 5th of 1989. For those of you that don't know, Fredericktown is about 90 miles southwest of St. Louis, and it's pretty much any town USA. It's a nice, quaint little town. My family and I actually go there every May for the family reunion, so I'm very familiar. And I can also say that present day, there are still missing posters and signs for Gina Dawn Brooks in that community. They are very troubled by it, and they really want to see resolution in this case for their community, but more importantly, for her family. So on August 5th, 1989, she came home around 10 o'clock after leaving her brother's baseball game. A short time later, she was going out for a bike ride on her 10-speed. That she never returned. Her disappearance was reported at 2 a.m. Her mom apparently got up, saw her brother was playing video games, and was like, "Hey, where's your sister?" And he's like, "Oh, she went out for a bike ride." You know how kids are. They're playing video games. Time gets away from them. So when they realize it's the middle of the night and she's nowhere to be found, panic sets in. They have things to take care of right now. It's very urgent. Gina had been seen standing near her church when a battered light gray, green, or blue station wagon with Missouri license plate pulled up and the driver spoke to her. She got back on her bike and turned south on Mine Lamont Road. Later, some witnesses, including Gina's boyfriend, heard someone screaming for help. A vehicle was seen turning left onto Franklin and driving towards Highway 67. Again, if you're not familiar with the area, Highway 67, within about 30 minutes, you can be to Interstate 55, which would take you anywhere from Chicago, Illinois to New Orleans, Louisiana. You can be gone in a flash from this particular area. Gina's bicycle was found abandoned on a residential lawn on High Street, 5 blocks from her home later that evening. There was no sign of her, and she has not been seen again. 3 men were implicated in Gina's disappearance in 1998, so 9 years after she had gone missing. Nathan Danny Williams was charged with Gina's murder in 1999. Investigators stated that Williams was identified by a witness as the man who was seated in the back of the station wagon with Gina the night she was abducted. Now, there's also been reports that he's made incriminating statements that he slit her throat, he did certain things to her, he could put an X on exactly where her body is buried. But then when investigators go back to re-interview him, he plays this cat and mouse game, decides he's not going to talk to them, mocks them. He's just a jackass is what it sounds like. So, on we go. Witnesses also identified Brian Squires as the driver of the station wagon. He has since died of cancer and AIDS-related complications in a St. Louis hospital. He allegedly made a deathbed statement to nurses implicating Williams and himself in Gina's abduction and murder, and implicating them in other crimes. Timothy R. Ballou, a friend of both Williams and Squires, was initially implicated in Gina's disappearance as well. Ballou admitted that he had lied to FBI agents on the location of her remains. Now let me tell you guys, he didn't just lie. He flat out told the biggest story of his life. He tells them that after they had killed her, they put her in an abandoned meat freezer with rotten deer and buried her in the middle of a 96-acre plot that his family owns not far from Fredericktown. So, from 1998 through 2001, law enforcement, all sorts of resources, spent countless hours out there searching and looking and doing anything they can to find her for nothing. Eventually it came through. He said he was lying. He pled guilty to that and he was sentenced to 30 months for lying. Williams pled not guilty to the first-degree murder charge against him in 1999. Authorities believe that he was the person responsible for killing Gina in 1989 by slitting her throat, and that Squires and Ballou helped him cover up the crime. Both Williams and Ballou have records of sex offenses and other crimes. Ballou was charged with second-degree murder in Gina's case. The murder charge against Ballou was dropped for lack of evidence in 1999, and he was charged instead with lying to investigators about where Gina's body was buried. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 30 months in prison. In 2003, the murder charge against Williams was also dropped. So basically what happened here between Williams and Ballou, law enforcement thinks these guys are their suspects. They firmly believe these guys had their hands dirty in this crime, and they are responsible for the disappearance of this sweet little girl. However, the only evidence they have is circumstantial, so they risk going to trial and having these guys acquitted. Then that brings up double jeopardy. So if these guys are acquitted now, new evidence comes to light, say next week even, they can't retry them based on the double jeopardy law, which is part of the Fifth Amendment. I'll leave a link to a video about a quick little 1.5-minute video about that so you can understand exactly what double jeopardy is. Okay, so back to this. Authorities still believe the men were involved in Gina's presumed murder, but stated there's not enough evidence to convict them at trial. Williams has been charged in the 1975 murder of a young St. Louis woman. That charge was also dropped for lack of evidence in 1998. Get this, 10 days before the trial was set to begin. St. Louis County Prosecutor Bob McCullough, he has been law enforcement here in St. Louis for as long as I can remember, forever, and he does not do well with cases involving children, cases involving these brutal attacks that Williams and these guys are accused of. So the fact that he had to drop these charges had to be absolutely devastating for him. So right now, Williams is still in prison for an unrelated rape conviction, which we'll talk about in just a second. And he's a suspect in the 1979 disappearance of another young woman. So not only is this guy a serial rapist and sex offender that he's in prison for now, but he's also a suspected, in my opinion, suspected serial killer to all these other women. There's even a report that he even told investigators at one time that he is responsible for at least 11 killings, but it's not worth his time to explain to law enforcement where they're all at. Okay, now we're going to discuss Tammy Rose Surdam, who was last seen in St. Charles, Missouri on August 1st, 1979. She was last seen at a youth shelter on the 500 block of Jefferson Street in St. Charles, Missouri. She'd stayed there for only a couple nights before she disappeared, and she's never been heard from again. Tammy was a chronic runaway who began getting in trouble in 1977 after her family had moved across town. She began spending time with people who her parents didn't necessarily approve of, kind of like the party crowd is what it sounds like. Her family also said she was too trusting and would have gotten into a stranger's vehicle. She was close to her father, however, didn't get in touch with her family after he had died in 1988. Because she was a chronic runaway, her family wasn't initially concerned by her absence. However, after years passed without them hearing from her, they got worried and eventually filed a missing persons report. Nathan Williams, the same guy we just discussed for Gina Dawn Brooks, reportedly told two witnesses he had abducted a 12-year-old girl off a street near a college in St. Charles in the late 1970s. He said he raped her, stabbed her, and buried her body. This would match the circumstances of Tammy's disappearance, as she is the only child that age who disappeared from that area in that time. She was never found, and the shelter she was staying at was just blocks from a college in the area. There is no evidence tying him, meaning Nathan Williams, to Tammy's case. However, her disappearance remains unsolved. Okay, guys, now we're going to discuss the 1975 murder of Laura Michele Dinwiddie, known as Michele to her friends and family. She moved to St. Louis in 1974 at the age of 23 with her work for VISTA, which stands for Volunteers in Service to America. It's often referred to as the Domestic Peace Corps. She helped children who had learning disabilities and behavior disorders. She volunteered to help inner city children with few resources to do after-school activities, learn how to swim. She did volunteer work at a school for the deaf. This young woman was amazing from what I can see, and it's a shame that she wasn't able to live to her full potential of what life could have given her, or what she could have given to the communities she could have been a part of. A friend discovered her body after she failed to show up for work. She had been stabbed 3 times and her throat had been slashed. She did not show signs of sexual assault, possibly because she struggled with her killer. Her case was cold for 3.5 years until in 1978, our friend Nathan Williams told a bartender that he knew who had killed Dinwiddie. Williams repeated his story to detectives and fingered a former friend who had been a neighbor of the slain woman. The young man named by Williams was arrested, but charges were soon dropped when investigators were unable to gather any evidence against him. The case was reopened once Michele's mom wrote a letter to the St. Louis County Prosecutor's Office and wanted to know the status of her daughter's case. At that time, law enforcement began interviewing everyone they could find who was mentioned in any of the old reports. He discovered that Nathan Williams was in Farmington, where he was serving a sentence for raping a 13-year-old girl in South St. Louis. The girl said her attacker held a meat cleaver against her throat during the assault. At age 19, Williams was tracked down in Wyoming and pled guilty. He was then paroled in March, which we kind of went over this timeline a little bit at the beginning. So we kind of know that he's got some pretty dirty hands. He kept himself busy with really horrible acts. Eventually, law enforcement cleared the 2 brothers that Williams kept implicating, and his law enforcement's leads kept coming back to Williams, who now refused to talk. Nathan Williams was actually married in prison at one point to a 70-year-old woman, and at that time he was only in his 30s. This woman told him not to talk to anybody, and she hired him a lawyer. In the weeks to follow, law enforcement unearthed statements allegedly linking Williams and his friend to both the Dinwiddie killing and the Gina Dawn Brooks abduction. Law enforcement found witnesses who said they had picked up Williams and the friend at an Amoco station at Salisbury Street and Interstate 70, North St. Louis, the night before Dinwiddie's body was found. Williams was covered in blood and had Dinwiddie's small radio, a credit card, some jewelry, and cash, the detectives were told. "We are very confident that he's our guy for both cases," said law enforcement. "There's too many things that fit." Okay, so now that you guys know a little bit more about each of these three women's cases, I'd like to know a little bit what you guys think of Nathan Williams. Do you think it's probable that he was involved in each of these cases? Or do you think it's more probable that he was a victim of law enforcement pushing him into a false confession? If we go with the false confession route, that would justify him changing his story regularly, just being all over the map, retracting statements, all those sorts of things that we see over and over from him for the last 30 years. But if we were to go with the idea that it's probable that he is involved, that's quite scary. Because if we go on that side, and we see, at least in these three linked cases, the murder of Laura Michele Dinwiddie happened in March of 1975. Nathan Williams would have only been 14 at that time. So if we assume that he is involved from a very young age in life, he was doing extremely horrible crimes and seemingly getting away with them. And even the ones he was convicted of early in life, he served very short prison sentences for. So I'm kind of curious what you guys think on that. I'm going to leave a bunch of information in the description box below for you guys to read more articles and more information on all of these women, for you guys to have the resources to provide tips to law enforcement, all sorts of things like that. So that's it for today, guys. Go ahead and click like, click subscribe, hit share, and leave a comment below. Have a great day.